So this is part 4 of the Cold War, and we're going to start here with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the next major crisis that comes up. Like I said in the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy learned a lot, and he learned not to listen to so many outside people, and he kind of gets an understanding that our military wants to fight a war. So he's going to trust himself and his close advisors a lot more, and start making his own decisions, and that becomes a major contribution to the Cuban Missile Crisis and keeping us out of a nuclear war. This will be the closest we come to nuclear war. So, well, the closest in the 60s, we got the 80s to get through, but this will be the closest in the 1960s, 70s we come to nuclear war. In response to the U.S. Missiles in Turkey, they sat 120 miles away from the Soviet border. The Russians began building nuclear missile bases in Cuba. The U.S. and Russia came the closest it's going to come until 1983 to nuclear war, when the Russians placed nuclear missiles in Cuba in October of 1962. So, the United States places an embargo on incoming shipments to Cuba from the Soviet Union, and the U.S. goes to DEFCON 3. DEFCON 1 is war. So this is big because all of Kennedy's advisors and all of the military advisors want Kennedy to launch an airstrike and invade Cuba, which would start World War III and a nuclear war. Kennedy decides on a blockade which is old, outdated, and virtually nobody in the military and his advisors would advise him to do this. And he goes with this, and this is actually what saves us from a nuclear war, is this blockade. So if we would have invaded Cuba, or we were to launch an airstrike, that would have been we would have started a war. So Soviet ships reached the quarantine line, but received radio orders from Moscow to hold their positions. So, as you see here, this is a picture of President Kennedy thinking during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kennedy threatens to invade Cuba unless Soviet missiles are removed. And when he does this, we go to DEFCON 2, which is, like I said, DEFCON 1. We're at war. The Russians agreed to take their missiles out of Cuba if the U.S. removed our missiles from Turkey. So, a quick timeline of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets put missiles in Cuba in the summer of 1962. October 14th, we found out about them through reconnaissance flights. October 22nd, JFK informs the nation. The 24th, the U.S. blockades Cuba. The 28th, Khrushchev removes the missiles. So if you look here, this is the range of some of the missiles. And up here, Onslow Bay, Camp Lejeune, Wilmington, we were definitely within the seconds. I think it would have taken 10 seconds for the missile to reach us. 12 seconds for D.C. and Seattle, Washington, or Washington State would have been 17 seconds. So think about that, a nuclear missile strike. One thing that we thought back then that we were informed on is that the missiles were at 90% capability. In other words, they were not quite ready to be fired. What we find out in 1991-92, when we researched this in the Soviet Union, they were 100% ready to go, and they would have been fired on us in a heartbeat. So that blockade actually saved the day in a lot of ways, and we didn't know this. Now, one of the key outcomes to this, really two of the key outcomes to this missile crisis was we set up a red line, a hotline to Moscow. So it's the red phone, and the president had direct access to the leader of the Soviet Union, and nuclear test ban, above ground test ban. These two measures come out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We also, when we removed the missiles from Turkey, we did it 6 months later, and we did it quietly, because this was in the public eye. When Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, brought the missiles back to the Soviet Union, it looked like we had won this thing, and some marked down in the papers and the media and all around the world as a big U.S. victory, but it really wasn't. We removed our missiles 6 months later very quietly. And basically, Khrushchev got exactly what he wanted. He got our missiles out of Turkey, but it's the way that it looked, it's perceived in the world, it's going to cost him his job because the communists in the Soviet Union thought that he looked weak in the world's eyes. So 18 months later, he loses his job. He's forced from power in 1964. So the domino theory, which with Khrushchev, a little bit more with him, there's a lot we could talk about with him, but one of the things you need to remember is he's very open-minded, and he has a lot of progressive reforms in the Soviet Union. And one of the people that's going to learn from him is a young man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. He was a Khrushchevite when he comes to power in the Soviet Union. We'll talk about him later. So, the domino theory. This is a theory that is believed that it's a belief that if one country fell to communism in a region, the other countries would fall to communism as well. And we see this in Southeast Asia. Okay, if you look at the picture up here, China, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, and India. Eventually, we felt that all of them would fall to communism if we allowed this stuff to keep growing. So, give you a quick history on nuclear weapons here. If you look at 1945, there's 6 nuclear weapons in the world, and the U.S. owns all of them. Look at 1955. The Soviet Union has 200. We have 3,000. Go to 1995. Look at that. Soviet Union has 27,000. We had 14,000. Look at 1985. Yeah. So, look at China, 1995.